Hi guys, thanks for tuning in and welcome to another episode of Radio Viska. This is another night walk episode, so I'll be strolling around on one of my midnight walks, and that just kind of helps my thinking a little bit on certain issues. I don't know, best thoughts come to me at night. So it's pretty empty here, but it's an odd person kind of strolling across the bridge. And the funny thing is, I don't even feel like I need to stop what I'm doing. Like, I just passed the guy right now. The reason I didn't feel like I had to kind of be worried about me and this podcast in any way is because the guy's got iPod headphones in, right? So, gosh, it might be that his music's turned off, but probably he's not listening to what I'm saying, right? Since I use my phone for these recordings, most people will just think that I'm speaking to someone on the phone anyway. It's interesting though. I mean, it's almost midnight, and there's still quite a lot of people walking here across this bridge, so it's not exactly dead at this time of night. It's kind of interesting. I'm just passing another guy, he's got iPod in as well. So, literally, I would say no one's going to hear what I'm saying here, which is pretty funny. It kind of gets me onto some of the topics I want to talk to. So I actually did a bit of preparation just now, a brief kind of list of topics I want to hit. And the whole iPod thing is, headphones thing is one of them. So it's like our entire society has become so, I mean, first of all, I understand why people listen to podcasts. I create podcasts, so, it's all fine and good with me. But it's often the unintended side consequences of technology that we kind of overlook. And sometimes I'm not even sure if it's unintended. So it kind of gets me on this topic of just where society's at the moment. And the iPod is just sort of a symptom of larger mass society really turning into this hostile place. So, if I just sort of look at the kind of interactions you have on a daily basis, really, in the sort of modern mass society. I just actually, just to interrupt, I did actually follow a guy, just pass a guy that didn't have his iPod headphones in, and you probably can tell in my voice that I kind of quietened down a bit. So I don't know, I mean, maybe that's me. That's kind of a strange personality trait, isn't it? I mean, I think most people do actually do that. They don't want to, like, it's fine for me to present my thoughts on the internet to possibly anyone, but in real life, I kind of don't want people hearing them. It's very strange, but yeah, just something I notice. Anyway, to give you a bit of detail, it's almost midnight. I'm walking towards the university, and out of the, gosh, how many people passed me now? 5 to 6. Only one of them was white. So the rest were actually all Asian. I think mostly Chinese. So, that's where we're at. And, these guys probably were studying or doing some form of university-related work up until this time of night. Which, I don't actually agree with. I mean, I don't think it's necessary or even necessarily always helpful, but that it certainly yields results of some sort, right? I mean, the reason, people in Africa never achieved anything is because they don't work hard like that. And certainly the Chinese have achieved things in their day, right? It's actually an interesting topic, the decline of China in, around 1500, and why China didn't continue developing the way Europe did, and what, I would say there probably are biological reasons for it. There's also civilizational reasons, cultural reasons, but that might be a good topic for another podcast at some point. Anyway, I'm getting totally off track here. So back to the iPods. So one of the reasons I guess people do wear those iPods is because, hey, everyone you pass on the street might not even understand you anyway. You're constantly walking past foreigners, and this is for the Chinese guy. They have that experience as well. First of all, they have a lot of different dialects, and not all Chinese are the same. But at the same time, they're in a foreign country. They constantly pass people they don't understand either. But what's more, it's not just that. It's mass society in general, right? So, I mean, I kind of imagine a world, like if you say look at Berlin or London maybe 100 years ago, right? Sure, there would have been some measure of diversity, but maybe those are bad examples. Let's look at any other city in Europe. Let's look at, think about Nuremberg or, Birmingham 100 years ago, right? I mean, there would have been very little diversity, and there would have even been little kind of less sort of intra-country migration, right? So the average person in Nuremberg I don't think the average person would have been a migrant from elsewhere in Germany even, 100 years ago. And the same goes for Birmingham or Manchester. I mean, maybe you'd have to put the point in history a bit further back for those cities, because obviously the Industrial Revolution did pull a lot of people in. But let's say 200 years ago, and would a stroll outside one's house, would that have felt the same way? Of course not. Some pretty funny animals jumping around here. That's the great thing about walking out at night. Nature kind of reemerges, and we're so cut off from nature, which is yet another one of my things I harp on. But just experiencing nature, I think, is something we should try to do almost every day. For me personally, it grounds me. It kind of I don't know, like we're in this weird world of technology and internet and apartments and trains and cars and planes, and like it's also virtual. It's also like kind of ethereal, like man-made and harsh, and just walking down the street and having a little squirrel hop in front of you. That's I don't know. There's something that kind of just reminds you're an animal. Hey, I'm an animal. Squirrel, you're an animal, and we're out here at night, and it's just. If something in that experience just totally heals you, it just sort of, I don't know, it just makes you feel better. I think it's probably evolutionary. Like, I think there's actual instinctual reasons for that, right? So I think that humans and all life forms have evolved you might be distracted by all the sounds of nature here now at the moment. I think all life forms have evolved some form of understanding their environment from a survival point of view. So birds have this for sure, right? And whales, right? They're very migratory, and they know exactly where they have to fly to, nest, and where they have to fly in summer and where they have to fly in winter. And the whales the same, they know where there's the krill and where waters are cold, and where they can have their babies and where it's safe from, and so on and so forth, right? So these are not, with whales that might be communicated in some form, but by and large these are instinctual behaviors, right? Literally the bird's knowledge of how to live and where to fly, and what landscapes and what areas of the planet are good are hard-coded into the genome. I find that absolutely fascinating. And what's interesting about it, it's not even like in all cases like visual cues. It's smells, it's magnetic kind of orienteering, right? It's sonar with dolphins. It's there's all these theories about why whales beach, whether it's the sonar or electromagnetic sort of radiation or some kind of disturbance. And the same goes for bees and like mobile phone signals and pesticides and all that. So the cues to a good place to live. The cues for a healthy, wholesome, this is where I will survive environment are literally hard-coded into your DNA, and you sense them as a living being, and every living being is different, but various ways of sensing them involve smell, visual cues, temperature, electromagnetic spectrum, sun, etc., right? So I think humans have this as well. I think humans definitely have this, and I think the type of landscape humans prefer depends on race. So, obviously a black person in anything more than 100 odd years or 200 years ago would have died in a low sun environment because of lack of being able to produce sun-related vitamins. There's also other issues like cold weather and bone density and being able to maintain heat and also clearly a way of thinking, a neural kind of adaptation. Moreover, I think there's also a sort of instinctual psychological kind of happiness factor to the whole thing, right? Like we get rewarded when we're in a kind of environment that we can easily survive in, because that's what kept us alive, right? In other words, those living beings that felt good in certain environments would only be the ones that were rewarded, with dopamine in environments that suited them well, survived, right? So if you're the kind of mutated human being and you get rewarded for liking the desert, right? You're not going to survive, right? I mean, you're sort of, if you're drawn to the desert for some reason and you think that's the most beautiful landscape, well, you're just going to die of thirst, and so that's not a very good instinct to have. So with Europeans generally, we tend to like mountainous landscapes. We tend to like waterfalls. We tend to like forests. We tend to like calm, sort of freshwater lakes. And, I think by and large this is similar for most humans, but I think there's probably some differences. I think there's actually, I think because of the extreme cold of, Northern Europe, I think it was especially important for Europeans to kind of evolve some form of preference for something like a fjord, right, where you're sheltered from the cold, where there's a warm freshwater or seawater body that kind of keeps, water keeps the heat. It kind of protects you a bit from the cold winter. And basically the kind of environments we see, like forests in Europe, right? I mean, we've evolved to them. And interestingly enough, obviously, we didn't like the sort of environments Eskimos live in, right? So I think, and also obviously whites didn't like to move to, Morocco or Cairo or, Zimbabwe or whatever, because, later they did with colonialism, but that's a post-biological behavior, right? So I suppose that's sort of a roundabout way of kind of giving this urge to be in nature a pseudo-scientific, evolutionary, psychological, evolutionary, biological explanation. But I think there's some truth to that. It's at least it's a good theory. And certainly if you can observe it in animals, right? So, if birds and whales and all sorts of other animals, big herds of caribou and whatever, wolves, basically any kind of animal that does any kind of seasonal migration, at the very least, is able to discern its environment in some way as beneficial or not. So, now I just had security guard drive past me here. I guess this is a sort of, all the security here, Indians or Arabs at these universities. It's just, who knows, you know, anyway. So yeah, so spending time in nature is literally a instinctual need, in my opinion, right? I mean, certainly we did not evolve to want to be in some kind of concrete, heavily Wi-Fi'd, microwave-saturated, pollution-filled jungle, you know, with millions of non-white other life forms, you know, non-local, non-biologically related, intelligent humans. You know, like it's one thing to be amongst squirrels, it's another thing to be amongst life forms that are intelligent, you know, not like animals, but are different to you, right? I mean, in some real, you know, there's that word alien for foreigners, and in a way, there is a sort of alien nature to it, right? You know, you kind of amongst these people that are also sentient, but in some way different to you, which I can imagine if you had sort of very humanoid aliens would be sort of similar, right? Of course, the differences might be stronger, but you know, I don't think that there's nothing at all to be said about this sort of weird alienation that you... And the word alienation, interestingly, you know, comes from the word alien. So we're in our modern society, we're constantly sort of shutting ourselves off from all of that around us. You know, there's a sort of need to adapt to it. You know, I mean, even just meeting strangers is something that is not really natural. But if you can recognize their facial structure, if you can, you know, recognize their accent, if you can recognize their fashion, if you know, I mean, if you know how they think, you can sort of... I mean, I grew up in a pretty much 100% European, ethnically European place. I'm you know, Gen X, so, I'm on the border between Gen X and millennial, but I remember how different that was. Like, I remember my childhood as completely different from an experiential point of view. Now, of course, I was a child, granted, but just the way everyone kind of knew what everyone else was doing, everyone knew which events were happening where, everyone knew, you know, kind of vaguely about the other people. You kind of knew them through 2 or 3 people removed, but you sort of knew of them. It's a completely different experience to living in a modern multicultural megalopolis. I mean, like London, for example. You know, I mean, you're just bombarded with strangers, and not increasingly today, you're bombarded with, non-Europeans, you know, and all Europeans from, you know, very different cultures, you know, Bulgarians or Russians or Greeks or whatever, you know. And, you know, to be honest, I don't even have a huge problem with the Greeks, but yeah, it's something that we naturally, you know, we're just going to dive into our iPods and just hide away from the whole thing. And that's what's really happening in any large city in the West, right? And it's interesting because I think there's a very different experience to large cities in Asia. So if you go to Tokyo, yeah, sure, there's some foreigners there, but it's at a sort of like kind of like a you know, you're kind of like a curiosity, you know. I mean, there's probably enough that Japanese are sort of generally used to it, but it's not a huge nuisance to them, except for maybe, you know, in like Yoyogi Park and similar places. And in that environment, you know, the behavior is simply different, right? So people just interact differently on the street. I mean, the one thing that I do have to say is that street life in Asian cities is far more vibrant, you know, there's that word again, than it is in multicultural Western cities. So maybe vibrancy does not follow from diversity. maybe shut-in syndrome follows from diversity. Now, I know that the Japanese have, the otaku and the shut-in phenomena as well, but if you go to Shinjuku or Shibuya or, Amerikamachi in Osaka, I've traveled Japan extensively, and in general, the kind of feeling on the street is one of safety and one of just sort of expression of Japanese people expressing various ideas and communicating with each other. And look, it's very consumerist as well, but I feel like if you compare it to, look, European cities are still vibrant, right? Don't get me wrong. The real problem comes with the sort of colonies in North America and Canada and Australia, where cities are just dead, after work, pretty much, right? Really, the Anglo-Saxon colonial, and I include America in that sort of model, is suburbs and then high-rises in the center, and the only time there's any people around in the city is during lunch break on work days, and then after 5 or 6 the place is deserted, right, and there's just kind of hoodlums running around. And I know this is not totally the case in places like San Francisco and New York, but a lot of other places it is. So that's a whole different story. Anyway, before I get too sidetracked here with comparing my travels around the world, I'll just get back onto my topics. So I had a little note here as well. Right, so what is important for one's life? What are we even facing, right? So I've obviously spoken a little bit about the problems of sort of societal problems of a city that's multicultural and mass society, but those are not the only issues we face as human beings, as Europeans, in the modern world. I think there's all sorts of factors that attack us. If I was to make a huge list, it'd start from just the water we drink, right? So this is a sort of fundamental assault on us as living beings, is the fact that water is fluoridated, right? And not only that in many places you also have other issues like, I think it was in Flint, Michigan, where Michael Moore's from. I think they had, lead poisoning in the water and other issues. Basically, it was undrinkable, right? Now, it's not like there's some kind of creek down the road, like in old times, where you can just, get your fresh water or a well or something. So your only other option is to buy it at some store where it's been shipped in. Now that store only works because there's oil, right? The whole supply chain management, and moreover, usually also due to supply chain reasons, the water's in plastic bottles, right? Now we all know that plastic bottles, especially BPA, contain that plastic leaks into the water, and water is the thing we consume most in our lives. So even trace amounts over, periods accumulate. So, in a place like Michigan, or, Flint, Michigan, you're either killed by the water out of the tap or you're killed out of the water bottles, right? And, what are you going to do? Collect rainwater, melt snow, right? That's illegal in some parts of the United States, actually. But, I actually think that's probably a good solution. Collect rainwater, right? But just to sort of look at the, I guess one way to frame things is that, sure, in the past, we may have every now and then drunk water that was bad, and some people got, diarrhea or something, or died, cholera. So yeah, that risk has been removed, or, well, it's not removed, but it's lessened. But we've got new risks, right? So really the kind of enemies we had in the past were things like disease, disease being really the number one enemy, and that enemy's been kind of replaced by more anthropomorphized kind of enemy, right? Like the elite, essentially, right? Like, I mean, even in the ancient times, as soon as humans achieved some level of technological advancement, their number one enemy was not nature anymore, it was other humans, right? So, barbarians, Roman army, the Persians, the Vikings, whoever, right? Slave traders, the Barbary corsairs, that favorite topic of the alt-right. So today, like with a monopoly on violence, that and most importantly, with the advancement of weaponry, nuclear weapons, that threat has actually kind of receded as well. And so we now, if you're like a normie, kind of TV zombie, you probably think there are no threats anymore, right? But I would disagree. I think the power of the state and the power of the rulers, of the farmers, so to speak, is a huge threat. And we're starting to see that form of threat materialize now in the modern world. So, that's kind of threat number one. And one of the manifestations of that kind of threat is you can't even fucking rely on the water you're drinking, right? Because it's obvious, right? It's the number one thing you consume day in, day out. And it's the obvious vector for any kind of delivery of any kind of chemical compounds, really. You might have heard that. I just passed a guy who was not on the iPhone, but on some kind of speaker Bluetooth thing. So I guess that's the show-off version of the iPod listener. Right, so I guess I went on some huge tangent here, but I think generally the topic for today was you kind of trying to frame the sort of, hurdles, the kind of dangers, the kind of, basically the things that are fucking with us, right? And I think, the number one step in any kind of what I would call response, if that's even possible, is to first recognize the things that are fucking with us. And also, of course, recognize who's the origin of these things. So I don't believe, I'm not a complete conspiracy nut, right? So I do believe conspiracies exist, and, in big historical events, I think they're likelier than unlikely, but not all manifestations of modern life are because of a conspiracy. So not all the dangers that we face in everyday late industrial economies are conspiracies, right? So for example, the BPA in the water bottles, I mean, that's been banned, right? So, or in many places, the BPA bottle has been taken out of the market. Was that a conspiracy? Did they know that the BPA, is a xenoestrogen and, bloody turns people gay or whatever, I don't know. I think I think as a good way to look at sort of any kind of event is to use the farm paradigm. This is George Orwell again here, And this is interesting, by the way. George Orwell's 1984 is constantly quoted, but a lot of people overlook Animal Farm. And I think Animal Farm is in some ways even more powerful, right? Because it's sort of it's almost more accurate to how modern society works. So for me, the way to look at things is the farmer's paradigm, right? Like the reason we're not all dead yet is because they need us as livestock, right? And our kind of farm is not one of slaughter. It's more like a chicken coop or a milk dairy farm or those kind of places, right? Or like, sheep for wool. So, maybe any kind of thing that happens in that society is just sort of like a kind of farmer's management of his livestock, and not really conspiratorial in any other way. Yeah, let's make a break here quickly. It's very interesting. The reason I made a quick break is I heard footsteps behind me, and as usual, talking about society as a farm and people as livestock. You're like, oh gee, I don't really want the average normie, kind of listening in on that. But of course, there was some young girl behind me, and of course she's also got iPod headphones in. So, no danger. And it was funny because when I stopped and let her pass, she started freaking out, and you could hear her footsteps, audibly quicken. So that's the sort of late at night, midnight. Well, it's past midnight now, kind of... Well, that's very interesting because it just illustrates how women actually instinctively feel, right? So, and that, that just destroys all the fucking equality bullshit, like, right away, The only reason that we can have even anything sort of similar to equality in like, treatment of people is because of the massive state and surveillance, right? I mean, so the biological entities are not equal, and they behave in a different way, and the whole surveillance, policing, state infrastructure makes it possible for women to be safe outside at night, at midnight, right? And now, before you guys start sort of thinking that, I'm some kind of fucking pervert here, my thinking, of course, in this situation as a sort of late industrial postmodernist male is, what's the thoughts that go through your mind? You're like, oh my God, she's probably thinking you're a danger. It's not comfortable to really be thought of that way. It sort of, it feels bad as well for a guy, really, in that kind of situation, right? And you're aware of that, like, say this is an attractive woman, and, say you do, as a normal biological entity, want to take the opportunity to maybe strike up a conversation. Immediately, that's some kind of bad thing, right? And you sort of feel like the cameras stop you from doing that. So there's also some kind of... people always talk about the low birth rates. I think modern society has an inherent anti-procreational bent to it. It makes it a lot harder to really interact with women, in many situations. Anyway, that's just an aside. I think I've sort of rambled on enough today. I'll probably continue this soon. My output's been pretty minimal recently, but I think everyone's sort of had if you look at generally across videos out there and across podcasts, a lot of places have a lot of channels have actually somehow minimize their output, and I don't know where that sort of, everyone's sort of tired of it, right? It's like there's this fatigue setting in, and obviously that's because, and maybe that's a little bit due to all the censorship and the black pilling. It's just become really hard, and and think that's probably the reaction they want, right? Is just people giving up. So funny enough, that's kind of what made me do this podcast today, even though I probably don't reach all that many people. So if you do like what I have to have, my late night ramblings, my musings, if it makes you feel like, hey, there's someone there thinking that, I'd like to get to know, say hello in the comments below, subscribe to me, share me with your friends, and make some podcasts of your own, and I'll listen into those. Talk to you soon, guys. Thanks for listening.